making a call to your mom or watching TV with your family, it all requires clean energy. And to make clean energy work, it requires significant amount of minerals and metals. It is very critical that these are produced and extracted in a way that is sustainable and it works for a future. Responsible mining standards are the heart of driving mining production and supporting companies going forward. Today we have more than 200 standards, and today we will talk a little bit about the standards, what's needed, how could we collaborate, and what is the standards within mining looking in the future. My name is Annika Andreasen. I'm the CEO of the Swedish Institute for Standards, SAS in Sweden. We are a country that is mining in our history, and we have a lot of mining in our country. With me today, I have a panel that will give you some perspectives of mining. I'm starting with John Lindberg, the Policy and Public Affairs Lead at ICMM, the International Council for Minerals and Metals. Ulrika Franke, former ISO president and also the chair of Swedish Institute for Standards, and Clifford Frimpong, Deputy Director General, Conformity Assessment for Ghana Standards Authority. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, just jumping ahead into the first question, what is the role of the global mining industry in achieving climate sustainable development objectives? Should we start with you, John?
Let's start with industry, yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. And I think it's pretty clear that without minerals and metals, there cannot be a transition. Everything from electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, you name it, there will be requirements for minerals and metals, and we know that these demands are rising and rising very rapidly. That means that we need to mine a lot more, and from representing about 1/3 of the global mining industry, certainly amongst our members, we feel a very strong sense of responsibility, not only to make sure that we have enough minerals and metals to meet the demand of the future, but also that these minerals and metals are produced in a responsible fashion. So I think that's really the crux of the matter. If we're talking about a just transition, we also need to make sure that the materials that goes into these technologies are actually produced responsibly.
Yeah. Thank you. It's back to where I started a little bit about all the clean energy that we need to produce all this for the future. Ulrika, what about the standards perspective?
Well, I think that John did raise some of the issues, but there is more. If you go back historically, there are more. It's a wider world of stakeholders today. So it's not only a business for the industry; it's the environmental. There are people more concerned today about the environment and what actually happens to land use and all that stuff. And that is, I think, where we can be a complement in the international standardization world of ISO and to what they are doing in the mining industry. So we are complementing them with inviting a larger group of stakeholders into the transformation and production of standards.
And we will come back a little bit about how we can collaborate in the best way for the industry. What about the accreditation perspective?
Well, thank you very much. From the perspective of the accreditation, I will also say, going back to what he said, we are transforming from the normal use to a low carbon and then the built industry. So we really need to have standards that will help with the conformity assessment. But like you rightly said, we have over 200 of the standards in place. How do we approach the conformity assessment aspect of it? We need to bring all these standards to a common platform that will help first the regulator, then the industry, and then the global decision, so that we can achieve whatever we have set out to achieve. So there is a need for the harmonization of the standards. That's what I would.
It's many perspectives to have in mind. What does this current landscape then? We talked about 200 standards, but what does the current landscape of standards for responsible raw material production look like? And how do you see this evolve in the future? It's a big question, but I think we have a little bit different perspectives. John, what do you say?
Well, I think Clifford spoke to it, really well already. It is a complicated landscape, and I think, as Clifford said, towards a harmonization and convergence is probably going to be an essential next step. Because certainly from our members' perspectives, we really see on the ground the difference the standards can make. Certainly when ICMM created the mining principles more than 20 years ago, there was definitely a need to start to rebuild that, if you like, that contract with society around mining. And in the sort of the 20 years that have passed since then, what we have seen is a very clear proliferation of standards towards the 200s that has been mentioned already. But really the challenge that we are now seeing is, with this proliferation, a lot of mining companies will have to implement a lot of standards at the same site that fundamentally are getting at the same issue.
Yeah.
You might be asking the question in a slightly different way. You might have commodity-specific standards, you might have jurisdiction or region-specific standards, but again, getting at the same issues, asking the question in a slightly different way. And this is starting to drive, it's driving cost for the implementing companies up, whilst at the same time that's not really resulting in, or rather is diverting resource, both human and actual, away from actually raising performance towards just showing conformity with, in some cases, maybe 5 to 10 different standards. So certainly from the implementer's perspective, that the landscape is in dire need of this, harmonization, convergence, so that, we have a small set of robust standards, because standards play a hugely important role, but not having to spend just as much effort on conformity and instead raising performance on the ground.
Yeah. So perhaps we need to look at these 200 standards and see how can we make it usable. Ulrika, what is your perspective from a standards
Well, I think
view?
that is why it's so important that we collaborate, so that we can, share knowledge about what standards are working and what is not working. But at the end of the day, it has to be that the standards has to be credible. People have to believe in them, and that is why I think it's, when I mentioned before that we have many more stakeholders, and you talk about the contract with society, so there's a different scope today. Opening a new mine today is a totally different thing when we historically opened mines, and there wasn't people that cared so much about that. And the process today with the environmental issues, with governments and all these people who are not so keen on us opening mines, they have a much larger voice today, and that has to be handled, and all the information we give have to be transparent, so they know exactly where it comes from. And I think this is a totally different scope than we had in the past. So I think collaboration is essential.
And we also have regional standardization to add on, actually. So it's even a little bit more complicated. What do you say, Clifford, about the?
All right. What I would say is I will look at it from 4 different areas. First, we have this industry standards and certification that are there. There are recognized frameworks that people are getting certified through. Are we able to bring it down? Let me take the case of Ghana as an example. We have the upper scale and then the lower scale. That is, the upper scale are those that are already established. They are already in business. They know all these international standards. Then you take the lower people who are entering into these illegalities and other things. How do we bridge that gap? So we need to look at the standards. Is it addressing the needs of these classes? Or we are just addressing a particular aspect and leaving the rest? If we are not careful, the target of getting this globalized way of reducing carbon, we will not be able to achieve it because we will leave a sector of the people behind. So there is a need, like I said from the beginning, engagement of all stakeholders so that we look at the standard. Is it a level playing field that we are playing, or we are just like imposing something on people? And will it be practicable for people to also comply with those things? There is a need for us to really take a critical look at that. And then make sure that if there are levels, maybe you start from somewhere and then you build on it till you can get to the highest pinnacle where there may be classifications of it. In that case, you are carrying them along and you will be able to achieve. Because it is a challenge that we have in Ghana, and we need really to get the standards to address it.
And I think if I can just jump in, and I think Clifford's actually is really onto something here, because I think it's certainly what we see, and ICMM represents 24 of the largest mining companies that operate across a broad range of jurisdictions and commodities. So for us, standards sort of are part and parcel of what we do. It's sort of ingrained in our operations. But I think it is really important to recognize that there isn't one mining industry. There's several mining industries. You have the really big companies that employ tens of hundreds of thousands of people across the globe, all the way down to the SMEs, where you might have 6 people running an extremely small mining operation. And also recognizing that we are in very different parts of our journeys towards responsibility. That's not to say that we shouldn't all strive towards it, but it's also recognizing that we are in different places in the journey, and we need to make sure that we provide enough support, capacity building, so on and so forth, so that we can take everyone with us, as Clifford says, on that journey towards excellence that ultimately we obviously want to strive for.
Yeah, you could see that it's very easy when you say mining companies, but they are very, as you say, different and also in different stages, of course. I think we are coming a little bit, how can standards convert climate commitment to action? Because I think it's good, we are into standards on the stage, but perhaps not everyone. So it would be good just to connect what you said. How can standards convert climate commitment to action?
I mean, I think part of it is going back to what I said perhaps in my opening remarks, that when it comes to climate action and standards play a hugely important role in ensuring that the materials that are produced are done so responsibly. And I don't think we can talk about meaningful climate action if they are irresponsibly produced. And if we want to go down slightly more technical, a lot of these performance standards on responsible mining do have chapters on carbon and mitigation and management of carbon as well. So you have inbuilt in these standards action towards decarbonisation in some cases at least. So that's probably how I would see it, the sort of convergence of those two topics.
What do you say, Ulrika?
Well, I would say that a couple of years ago, ISO as an organization committed itself to see that all standards that are developed will help this transition that we have to go through. And we went also through some of the old standards to see that they are modernized, if I should use that word, so that we are committed to deliver tools for the world to be used in this transition. And having a comment also on the SMEs, I mean, I think this is it's an ongoing challenge, not only in the mining industry, but it's a tough challenge to get all the SMEs on board in the work of creating standards, because obviously they don't have the same resources as the larger companies. So I think that is, when we have a model when everybody is invited to take part, that is one thing. It can be hard for a small company to be there, but afterwards we reach out, and everybody then has a possibility. I think you do the same. You reach out so that everybody can have their opinion put on the table when it comes to creating a standard. And
Yeah.
I think we should always be aware that this is probably the easier way for the SMEs to take part in the standardization work. But we should never forget it. They don't have the same opportunities as the large companies, and we always have to carry that with us. Because they, as a group, are quite big, much larger probably than the larger companies.
Yeah.
All right. I will also say that the standards that are developed should define clear targets, measurable ones that are specific to guide the users. Because if these are vague, first, the operator does not know where he is going. Then the regulator too has nothing to compare what he is seeing with. So it is important that the standard should provide specific targets and then measurable measurements so that we should be able to measure performance across the distance. Another aspect too is technology is advancing and our standards catching up with those technologies so that we can provide guidance for the operators. We really need to get into that to do it. And then driving consistency across the board. Are we consistent in the work we are doing, taking all the 200 standards that we are talking about? Are they all driving towards a common goal or they are divergence? How do we bring them to a common place so that there will be a common platform, whether I am operating in a developing country or I'm operating in an already developed country?
Yeah.
Can we compare the two? We need to establish that. And once these things are done, we can bridge that gap. And then the actions that we need can be implemented. That's what I was saying.
Defining how to measure is a really key thing for standards. So that's I fully agree on that. If we bring that a little bit onto how do we balance the gold standard, if I put it like, of an environmental protection with the silver lining of economical growth? Because I mean, it's setting values, as you said, and setting targets. I mean, how is the balance between the best sustainable, from a sustainable perspective standard, and what is more from an economic perspective? Do you would like to comment, Stan?
I mean, happy to. So certainly from our perspective, I don't think there's a conflict between doing things responsibly, so be that, you know, whatever we define as gold. Also, defining stuff as gold standard is inherently subjective. We all have different takes on what that means. But, you know, doing things responsibly, protecting the environment, respecting the rights of affected communities, is not an and/or when it comes to economic growth. You can certainly do both, and I think that there are plenty of examples of that around the world where you do have mining and associated industry that does deliver a lot of growth and economic wealth at the same time that you can still protect the environment. So I don't think it's an either or. And then obviously we have certain areas that we as a collective might deem too sensitive to do mining, and then we should take the appropriate actions to say that this is actually too special, this has too much environmental value or whatever, we should not be going here. But then we need to have that decision as a society that we shouldn't go here, and understanding that that's the trade-off that we do.
What's your view, Ulrika, on this?
Well, I don't think it's, I could just echo what you said, because I don't think there is a problem between this. The market is driving this.
Yes.
And at the end, the end consumer will want to know that this is done in a sustainable way, and it's that makes me, know what I'm buying and so on. And that's where also standards come in, because if you know as a consumer that it is produced in a certain way to a certain standard, you can be reassured that you're doing the right thing. But I think the most of industry is committed to in this transition that we are in, and are working quite hard on it. And they will also get some help for the auditors and things like that, because legislation is pushing that you have to get rid of greenwashing, and so on, and then coming back what Clifford said on validation, what we are measuring and so on. So there is a lot of transition going on, and I think everybody is sort of recognizing that this is a good thing, and it's market driven, which I think is also very, very good. Not only policies, but it's actually market driven. So there's no conflict.
And that's good, because usually that's what we hear, that no, standards will drive something that the market doesn't want.
No, but
Do you have any more comments on that, Clifford?
What I will also add to what has been said is Ghana has a case study in the area of the energy sector where IEC standards were adopted and incorporated into a legislation, so that appliances that are being brought into the country now are regulated based on legislation. And I believe it is helping in the economic wise, so that anti-dumping is being prevented. In the same way, we can apply it into this minerals sector. The standards, if they are there, it will guide policy. And governments can pick it up and it will improve their economies. So definitely, they said, yes, we have the policy side, and then the market side is also there. It's very important.
Now I'm jumping a little bit into the UN Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition mineral that has been held, and John, you were there. I heard that strengthen international cooperation was one of the main conclusions. Would you give us an update and some of your reflections?
I'm very happy to. And some of this is very hot off the press, because we met with the Secretary General here at COP29 2 days ago to really discuss. So this panel was convened by the Secretary General, and we spent the summer essentially trying to come up with a set of voluntary principles on, what does responsible mining look like? Because, there's again broad recognition of the importance of this in the transition, and as you say, two areas that I think is very pertinent for this panel is strengthening international cooperation and harmonization of standards, because there is specific language even to standards there, so there's recognition there. And it is really clear that the critical minerals conversation is being held in a lot of different forums. Even within the UN, you have 5 different bodies that are discussing it. Coming together and having that conversation is really important. And if we sort of scale it back a bit to standards as well, we have, of the 200 standards in the mining space, the vast majority of those live outside of the ISO system. And then on top of that, we obviously have the ISO standards. And I think in the past that there has been, not as much cooperation between these two ecosystems, because certainly from an industry perspective, ICMM, we built our own standard, so we know how this works. It's been implemented on the ground. How do we come together and leverage the strengths that sits in the different constituencies? And I think that's good. That's going to be really important, because standards are going to continue to, I think, play a hugely important role, especially as a lot of the mining we're expecting to see for the transition might happen in jurisdictions where there are governance challenges, for instance, where standards become even more important, which means that coming together and collaborating between the ecosystem is of the highest importance.
Thank you. Do you have any comments?
Well, I would just say that collaboration, of course, is crucial in this, and it has to do also that we spend the resources on the right level, on the right issues, because we can't go all over the place. And it's also always a challenge when a topic gets really hot. A lot of people get involved, a lot of people start working on it, and then you have groups that come up with new ideas and maybe new standards for a way, and they are not connected to the organizations or the infrastructure that already exists. So we have seen this in a lot of areas where a lot of groups come up and start talking about we have to standardize that. And so this is a challenge to get everybody into the same movement, so we go in the same direction, so we collaborate. But it's not new. It has happened to green steel, for instance, had the same problem, that everybody was there and wanted to create standards, but we have to collaborate and use the resources effectively.
Hydrogen is another
Hydrogen was
example.
another example when it happened.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on that, because I think we're starting to see that potentially a bit more outside the ISO system, but hopefully this is a start to something else. But so what we are seeing now, for instance, is collaboration on consolidating, as Clifford was saying earlier, consolidating some of these standards. So ICMM at the moment is consolidating alongside with 3 other partners 4 of the world's most widely applied standards, again in recognition of the fact that standards are important, but also we need to simplify so we can drive performance at scale. And then, like, I think from that initiative, I'm sure that we can find even more than common ground to collaborate between the different ecosystems.
I'm sure we can, and we also have to recognize that there is a regional dimension in this as well. It's not only an international dimension, it's a regional dimension, and maybe a national dimension as well. So there are different levels where we have to cooperate, and so we can engulf everything into the system.
Do you have any reflection?
Well, I think it's a summary of all
Yeah,
that
yeah.
collaboration,
Yeah.
harmonization.
Yeah.
So it's the right direction
Yeah.
we are supposed to go. And I think the Secretary General has just mentioned it.
Yeah.
So I would say let us all get together, the various associations or standard setting organizations, so that we can serve the populace better.
You mentioned developing countries before. What role can international organizations play in building capacity and providing technical assistance to countries to help them with the global sustainability goals and in the critical mineral sector? What would you say?
Well, I will first say that, yes, the standards have been developed, but do everybody understand the contents of the standards? So training and awareness is one thing that is key. How do you bring the standard to the level of the ordinary person so that they can take it and implement it? Then to the regulators, they also need to be guided, understanding, so that they also have the training to supervise or to measure the performance of what is also happening. So training and awareness is one way that we can look at capacity building. And then for governments also giving direction as to the role standards can play in whatever that is happening within the country. Let's take Ghana. Maybe some of us here may have heard what is happening in illegal mining and other things, destroying water bodies, deforestation and all that. Standards have been relegated to the background. And assuming standards were playing the lead role, definitely we will know that these are the pillars that we are supposed to build on. But unfortunately, that is not it, all because the fragmentation of the standards that are there. So it is important that we also give policy direction to government. It's a capacity that we can do.
What do you say, John and Ulrike? Start with you, John.
I mean, I agree with what's been said for sure, and I think government capacity building is crucial when it comes to this. But if you allow a slightly different perspective, so the majority of ICMM's members operate in more than one jurisdiction. Many of them operate in 20, 30 different jurisdictions, some of which will be heavily regulated, and we have an extremely mature sort of regulatory framework that works extremely well. And then you might have operations in jurisdictions that are more challenging, where you might have governance challenges, or where capacity isn't as strong as we would want. And I think in these instances, these companies become not just standard bearers, but also standard carriers, because the way that standards are being used, they're being implemented the same way across the maybe 20 or 30 different jurisdictions that you operate in. So you bring these norms and standards with you into these jurisdictions, which means that we start to build some of that capacity in country where we operate these assets, where in some cases the standards that we bring in with us far exceeds the sort of the regulatory expectations in that specific country. So I think that's a great example for us at least where you can see standards make a huge positive impact on the ground, and again also helps to build a lot of that capacity in country.
Well, of course, it's evident that the peers can always be role models for the SMEs moving forward and set their kind of standards and helping setting standards. But I think there is also more need where it comes for capacity building in some of the developing countries. And ISO is committed to that, and Sweden is the largest contributor to that, actually. And we do also the different NSBs, national standardization bodies, in the ISO family, as CES does as well, take part in developing projects together with the countries to enhance their ability to take on standards and to also implement them, not only building the organizations, but also to implement it in the actual industries, in the actual work, so they get to know how to use standards. So there's a lot of things going on within the standardization community to help these, to get rid of some of that, which you mentioned, Clifford. So we do what we can on that. But I think it's vital also there is influences from the peers to being the models that go move forward. So we need both. We need both. For small companies usually want to be large companies at the end of the day, and they have to take on the standards then if they are to achieve them.
Yeah.
But I think you had an interesting point, Clifford, because I think we usually in capacity building more talk about the system than really the standards. So that's something that is interesting to bring on. I would just like to talk a little bit about involvement, because considering the diverse range of stakeholders that is involved, and I think that is, you mentioned a lot of variety of companies, but there is a lot of stakeholders in the critical mineral supply chain. How can we ensure that all voices are heard, that all participates, including those from developing countries? So we are not only having, the some top or some countries engaged. What do you say? I start with you, Clifford.
All right. I would say I think the standard development process looks at that, always encompassing everybody. It is not one person's mind. They bring everybody on board to form the technical committee. They look at it, and then after it is done, it is also given to the general public for comments to be made. So I think the inclusion or the inclusiveness is there, but maybe as to whether people really have interest in what is happening is also another aspect that we have to look at. Because most of the time you will give a draft out for public comments, and maybe one person will bring a comment. And in that case, when you roll it out, then you start getting the feedback. So let's go down to the people, let them understand the standard development process, and then the role they have to play, so that when you roll it out and give the public this thing for public comments, they will be able to make inputs, so that it will be owned by everybody, not just the elite.
Do you have any?
Well, yeah, I would say I think we should recognize it and be honest and say that this is a challenge. The system is open for everybody, but it means also that everybody has to be engaged, and you don't really know when you have to be engaged if you don't know anything about the standardization system. So I think we should all be clear on that. This is a challenge, and usually opinions wake up when there's an article in a newspaper or something happening, and then it's too late often. I mean, so this is a challenge. And we can always say, well, this is a standard and everybody has been invited, but if you don't know about it, you're not there. So, I mean, this is a challenge, and I think we should be clear about that. The system provides for everybody to take part, but do they know they have the opportunity to take part? That is, I think,
Yeah.
But I see also the standard system is being more and more recognized in the world, and more people know about the standardization system, and more policymakers are interested in the standardization system. So the knowledge is actually growing, and I think that is a good thing, because that will mean that more people will probably take part. NGOs coming in early in the system, environmental groups also knowing what is going on and so on. It would be great if they were there in the standardization system, whether it's at your place or ours in the system.
I mean, I obviously completely agree, and I think on an issue like mining, where in certain cases, there are very differing views between a huge variety of stakeholders, I think the role for collaboration, partnership, dialogue is absolutely crucial, and that obviously translates very clearly into the world of standards as well. We need to have everyone involved in the processes. We need everyone to provide their thoughts, views, feedback. Sometimes, it gets uncomfortable because, some of these issues, we might not always see eye to eye, and sometimes we're able to come to an agreement, and sometimes we won't. But I think it's important that we keep that space for open, honest, and frank dialogue open. That we don't, stick in our silos where it's comfortable, where it's safe, but instead we should be coming together and really air these issues, because as has been highlighted time and time again, even at this COP, there is going to be a lot more mining required if we are going to transition to a clean energy system that also meets the needs of the 90% of the human population that today do not have the same level of access as even the EU average.
Yeah.
And in order to make sure that is done fairly, we need to have standards, and we need to come together. And an example, for instance, with the CMSI initiative that's now out on public consultation, we are traveling around the world to make sure that people can meet with us, engage with us, have conversations about the standard that we've developed around its assurance systems, its governance, so that we can have these open and frank conversations. And honestly, some of those conversations have been a bit challenging, but that's the whole point.
Excellent.
We want people to engage, because otherwise, why are we here?
We need the dialogue, and we need the cooperation, and not one should not do everything. We need to complement each other.
Exactly.
Now we have a closing remark from Andy, but before we go into closing this session, I would like to ask, is there any questions in the room? So there's some questions, so let's start with them.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you, Brian.
I think it's
It's
working.
good?
Yeah,
Thank you so much for this very rich conversation. My name is Brian Bishkul. I'm indigenous. I'm Maya Tsutujil from Guatemala. And I'm here with Surge Coalition, which is short for Securing Indigenous Rights in the Green Economy. We know that 54% of the projects currently extracting transition minerals are on or near indigenous lands. So this is a very important issue for us, and specifically the issue of standards. And yes, we heard from the conversation today the issue of listening to each other, participation, which you said. But what about decision making? Because for us, indigenous peoples, many communities are having a very dire situation where extraction is already happening. Indigenous peoples in the Atacama Desert have no water, so somebody else can have lithium. And so for us, the issue of participation is really important. Will indigenous communities or will have veto power when these projects will impact their lives directly? And as we've seen, we know from the standard that's been developed by ICMM, the CMSI, for example, offers a process where companies would still be allowed to go ahead with their project without obtaining indigenous people's free, prior, and informed consent, which is an internationally recognized right in UNRIP. We acquired this right in 2007 when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed. So
Thank you. Well, let's, Ulrika, would you like to comment on
I think-
participation?
Well, I think that this is an issue that we do have in Sweden as well. It's on the agenda always, and I think that it's clear that standards can give you the ability to start mining. That is a different issue. But standards can give you the opportunity to see that everything is there, that you're taking care of everything, that all issues are answered, taken care of. But the actual investment decision and go ahead would not be something for a standard. That has to be somebody else taking that decision, even if it is a decision between the company as such and the country it's in. So that doesn't sort of, the standard would make it more clear, more open to see that the process of giving the rights to the mining has been done in a correct way, but it wouldn't give you the actual right to mine. And I think that was something that we have to be clear about. I don't think you anticipated the fact that the standards that you develop would give you the right to mine, only the way that you've done it in a good way and answered all the questions and taken all the care. And so that the dialogue has been there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and agree. You know, the dialogue piece is super important. And Brian, I really appreciate your question. And you know, the only thing I can add probably to that is, you know, CMSI, the standard is now out for draft consultation. You know, we are on consultation because we want to make sure that we get feedback from across the ecosystem that has a interest stake in mining. And lastly, to say also that CMSI, the draft standard as it's standing right now, does align with the international human rights framework, including UNDRIP.
I know there was a question over there, and then we go ahead.
Hello, Coleman O'Creadine is my name with WWF. Can you hear?
Could you please, yeah, thank you.
So I have two questions, if I may. First of all, how can the manufacturing industry... How can... Oh, that's better, yeah.
That's better.
Yeah, so Coleman O'Creadine, WWF. Two questions. First of all, how can the manufacturing industry, that are the first chain in the consumers, support the standards in terms of their marketing policy? And the second question, you've partly answered it, but you may have additional remarks, is how can CSOs like ours support these standards as well? Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I?
Yeah,
Shall I start?
please.
And thank you for those questions. I think they're very, very, very good. So the first one on consumers and especially those that buy these materials. I mean, a good starting point is A, to recognize the importance of standards, not only in rhetoric, but actually start to make purchasing decisions based on standards and the use of standards. I mean, associated with that is, if you do things responsibly, that tends to come at a higher cost. I mean, that's beggars belief, right? So it's recognizing that responsibly produced minerals and metals comes with that cost. That's a broader conversation that we need to have about how do we recognize that. But if we don't even have that most basic recognition, yeah, I mean, everything else falls apart from there. And on the engagement piece, sort of just reiterating my earlier remark from a CMSI perspective, we got the draft standard, its assurance systems, governance and claims policy out on public consultation until the 16th of December. Please engage, please provide your feedback to that. I'm going to be here at COP until next week, so if you want to have a conversation with me in the flesh, very happy to do so. And then, as I said, we got the consultation open. But Ulrika, maybe you want to come in on...
I just wanted to make one small comment on that, and that is there is other legislations coming forward that would say that a company has to state the origin of the material used for processes and so on. And in doing so, they have to also lean on standards to tell that that's done in a good way or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think this is moving forward quite rapidly, and ISO took an initiative to meet with the accounting world to see that the new initiatives that have been taken to get rid of greenwashing also is combined with standards that are used by the industry to get it aligned, so we don't even get new systems which we don't really want to get it all aligned. So there are a lot of things happening to ensure consumers that they are getting the best.
And consistency, and I think it's
yes.
very important to mention that. Thank you, Ulrika. Please.
Oh, can't hear.
I think it's... Yeah, it's...
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, hello, I'm Sofia Fernandez with the Climate and Land Use Alliance, so also from a different part of this COP, and trying to come here because it's something that in the forest protection and indigenous rights communities we're starting to look at more carefully. So I do appreciate that you're open to having these uncomfortable conversations. For me, I live in Ecuador, so something that we've been seeing is that a lot of the critical mineral mining is being lumped into other types of mining, and mining companies are using this as a justification to just ramp up operations with the mandate for the energy transition. So I was wondering how that's something that's being grappled with with the different mining companies and the ecosystem as such, is how do we really define what the critical minerals that are necessary are, and how we don't justify it as just a complete ramp up of mining operations in very delicate ecosystems. And also I was really interested in what you mentioned about some of the red lines that maybe mining companies have of where we won't operate, and how that's being started in discussions with governments and such, because I do understand that standards are not the defining move of that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I
Big
think-
question. Do you...
I think that's a truly excellent question, and I think you're really getting to a tension which certainly has made me personally, and I think others in the mining industry also quite uncomfortable, is the notion of if you have a boom that you somehow are allowed to throw out the rule book, because in the name of the transition we need to get everything out of the ground now, and everything, environmental protection, social rights, that's a huge fallacy that we are definitely trying to get governments to understand, that it doesn't matter if it's critical or not. You should always mine responsibly, because criticality, who defines that a mineral is critical or not? Look around this room and ask everyone here to give you a list of what's a critical mineral and what's not. We'll have 3 or 4 that will probably come up in common, but the rest of them is going to be a complete scattergun. So criticality is a challenging concept in of itself. So the fundamental thing here is that you should mine critical minerals as if they were not. So responsibility is always paramount. And on the second point around, red lines. So for instance, ICMM 20 years ago, our members made a commitment that we wouldn't mine in World Heritage sites. And I don't want to say we were the first industry organization to come up with that commitment. We're definitely one of the first to have done so. So that is, for instance, one red line for us, and I'm sure other companies got others. But I think, going back to the conversation we had earlier, when it comes to areas that we think are too critically important, be it for whatever reason, we need to come together as a society and say, area X, area Y, this is too important to do mining, farming, or any sort of heavy industrial development. But we need to have that conversation as a society.
Thank you. An important question.
Yes.
Now it's time's running. A short one. We try to make it short, and then the final one.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My name is Vigya Sharma. I am a researcher academic at the University of Queensland in Australia. My question is around, there's no denying that the standards are a great step forward, but I guess my question is more around they remain voluntary in nature. So we talk about the big mining companies, which are ICMM member companies, for example, or the Copper Mark member companies, they are under greater public scrutiny, investor scrutiny, media scrutiny. So their likelihood is that they would take up standard. What about the small operators who are sprouting everywhere across Asia and Africa, taking into the opportunity of the green mining boom for the green transition?
as a global collective community here, what can we be doing together to make sure that they are also the ones who are paying attention to the standard and recognize the benefit of the standard for everybody involved?
To implementation of standards.
Well, I touched on that before, because we do come to the facts of capacity building in some of the developing countries, and we try to do that. But we also try to be involved for the different standardization bodies in different countries, to be involved in projects to help implementing the standards, not only making the capacity building for organizations and such, but also implementing in a lot of projects. And of course, as I said, the SMEs are a very big challenge. And we have to recognize that, because they are not part of creating the standards, but we have to tell them about the standards. And I think that when companies now have to state the origin of materials, they will, at the end of the day, end up at a small SME as well, because they are also part of the larger industrial world.
Absolutely.
So they will be there. But it will take more time, absolutely, but we have to be aware of it, always.
And just coming in very shortly
Yes,
on
yes.
that, it's a great question. It's certainly something that from my CMM and our members' perspective is something that we're grappling with. Because as you say, we are under a huge amount of public scrutiny, and rightfully so. But 2/3 of the sector is not sort of the large-scale diversified miners. It is the SMEs. And certainly they do play a huge role, but also we see that a lot of the really big impacts, the big impacts from the large-scale miners, but also from the SMEs. But I think, and going back to the gentleman's question earlier about, it's about how do we make this normative? And sure, capacity building and making sure that everyone can join us on that journey is super important, but we also need to have one eye on, today it isn't normative to have responsibly produced minerals and metals. We need, as a global community, to say we reject anything that isn't, and we are not there yet. And that's a conversation that is much bigger than for this panel, but one that needs to happen, and needs to happen now, because the critical minerals boom, if you want to call it that, is happening now.
Thank you. Now I'm going to bring up my colleague Andy. Please, come up here.
I need to stand up.
Yes,
Okay.
you have to stand.
Okay, thank you.
You
very
have
much.
been listening into the conversation, and please, would you like to try to first present yourself and then try to wrap up?
Yes, of course. So I'm Andy. I work for ISO. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Secretary General on Sustainability and Strategic Partnerships. So I've been listening and trying to think how I would explain this to my grandmother. And so I've broken it down into three key areas. Firstly, we're all dependent on the essential products that come out of the ground, especially for a new and sustainable world. Okay, there's nothing we can do to avoid that, but it has to be done in a responsible way. That's the first point. The second point is we're also dependent on standards to make that happen, not just regulation. And those standards need to be credible at the national, regional, and international level. That means we need broad engagement in the creation of those standards, so they take all voices into consideration. There needs to be more coherence between the standards that are developed, that are revised, and the standards bodies themselves. They need to work much more closely together to align what they do with each other, but also with regulation, with the laws, with the parties and the decisions and the negotiations they're coming up with here, for example. And they need to function effectively in this rapidly changing world. The third point is about calls to action. It's about engaging. It's about you here engaging in the development and the revision of these standards. And we're happy to talk to you about how to do that. You can come and find any of the organizations with their logos on this pavilion, and we can talk to you about how to make that happen. So get involved there, but also for you to hold the standards bodies accountable, those that use standards accountable, and the policymakers accountable for the use of those standards and the development of those as they inspire and support regulations as well. I think.
Thank you. Good summary.
Beautifully
I would say
done.
thank you. Before I let the panel go, I would just like to ask you one thing. What is the most important thing that we need to do now? So one thing each.
God.
Call for action. So
oh
what
God,
is the
yeah.
most important thing?
Okay, so the most important thing.
Most important thing.
I mean, as Andy has so beautifully put it, engage. So, you know, be it engaging in the critical minerals conversation, be it engaging in the CMSI, be it engaging with me here, being engaged with others in the standard space. Engage.
Ulrika.
No, I think it's the engagement, and if you know anybody in the SME world who should be engaged in this, please contact them, give them to contact us so that we can help them, get them on board. I think that is, engagement is key.
Engagement. And then finally,
And then I will
Clifford.
also say fair balance.
Oh, sorry.
Fair balance
Yeah.
in the content of the standard and then in the engagement, so
Yeah.
that it will not be twisted towards one side.
Thank you so much. Thank you here in the audience. Thank you for your questions. I think we have a QR code for the evaluation that will come up on the screens. So thank you very much.